The Vietnam War, or the Second Indochina War, was one of the most brutal wars of the 20th century. Although with not the most casualties, it was hell for anyone involved. It began in 1955, but what were the causes for this war? It was part of a bigger conflict known as the Cold War, where the US and the USSR would go at each other's throats in proxy wars all across the world. Now, why couldn't they just go against each other? Well, both the US and the USSR had masses of nuclear stockpiles, so if both of them went to war, they'd bring the world with them. And sadly, Vietnam were one of these stages for a proxy war, and so, because both the US and the USSR fearing each other's influences, the Vietnam War had begun. South Vietnam, although with the assurance of the US, it was plagued with corruption and infighting. So no matter how much war advisors and equipment the US sent to South Vietnam, the South Vietnamese war effort was appalling. But because of the US fearing communism, they came up with many theories on how communism would spread, and the one they used for Asia was the domino theory. It was the idea that one small country falls, it could threaten more major countries with bigger populations, larger land reach, and most of all, greater influence. So the US could not and would not let South Vietnam fall. Before I continue, it'd be ignorant not to mention this. South Vietnam, throughout the reign of Ngo Dinh was committing an ethnic cleansing against the Buddhist majority, because the leader, Ngo Dinh was a staunch Catholic, and as you saw, the Buddhist majority in the past had been harassing the Catholic minority. But in any sense or world, reasoning doesn't excuse the killing of people based on their race, religion, or anything of the kind. The reason I bring this up is because later on down the line, this would damage South Vietnam's unity. But let's continue. To already help the South Vietnamese instability, on the 1st of November 1963, the South Vietnamese military performed a coup d'etat against Ngo Dinh's government. Ngo Dinh and his brother were brutally assassinated, and General Dong Van Minh took over as head of state. A rebel group known as the Viet Cong, who wanted to unite South and North Vietnam under communism, took advantage of this instability and strengthened their position with the people of the South. And to add more insult to injury, John F. Kennedy, the US president, was assassinated a month later in Dallas, Texas. Lyndon B. Johnson, or LBJ, succeeded him. After a couple more coups in South Vietnam, General Nguyen Khan became president. On August 2nd, 1964, the USS Maddox was monitoring signals from North Vietnam in the Gulf of Tonkin. It fired 3 warning shots at some North Vietnamese torpedo boats, whom, in retaliation, opened up fire with machine guns and torpedoes. And so the USS Maddox returned fire. The small skirmish resulted in 4 Vietnamese casualties and no US casualties. And 2 days later, the USS Maddox reported a similar incident, but this one turned out to be false. But not before these incidents were used to launch airstrikes on North Vietnam, and to get Congress to pass through the Tonkin Resolution, which allowed Lyndon B. Johnson to escalate the conflict without actually declaring war. Now, don't worry, Lyndon B. Johnson did assure the people that he would not be sending over US troops before being re-elected. A lot of people think conscription, or the draft, was unique to the Vietnam War, but the US had actually been doing it since 1940 to fill in gaps in the military. But with the upcoming Vietnam War, many people fled, which was a criminal offence. Come 1965, the South Vietnamese war effort was in shambles. The Viet Cong and the People's Army of Vietnam were beating them at every point. What tipped the US over into sending troops was the Viet Cong attacking a helicopter facility. In retaliation, the US heavily bombed the north, and so the US decided the South Vietnamese army wouldn't be enough to guard the US holdings. So, on the 8th of March, the first US troops landed in Vietnam and brought their allies with them. And so, the Vietnam War had begun for the Western world. To start off with, why couldn't the US just trample over the North Vietnamese? Well, the US had learnt their lesson from Korea. In the Korean War, the UN coalition invaded North Korea after pushing back the Northern Offensive. They reached all the way to Manchuria in the People's Republic of China, and so China retaliated by sending thousands of troops into Korea to help out the communists, which pushed back the UN forces all the way to the DMZ. And so in the end, the US was left with a stalemate, along with a lot of dead US troops, so a strategy wouldn't work. But if the South Vietnamese occupied the north, then if the Chinese sent troops, well, that'd be an act of war against the South, and that would mean the US could send troops into Vietnam, and maybe even further. But after realising that South Vietnam without help would most definitely fall, the US had to protect their interests in the region. So you can kind of see that the US had no other choice. Equipment didn't work, advisors didn't work either, so the US had to do what had to be done. Neighbouring Laos had been in a civil war since 1962, known as the Latosian Civil War, between the Loyalist East and the Communist West. It didn't become significant until now. Because of the Vietnam War, North Vietnam could use the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which, as you know, was significant to the North's victory, because it provided access to the whole of the South and not the easily defendable 17th parallel. But as soon as the Tonkin Resolution was signed, the US and its allies heavily bombed Laos and Cambodia, known as Operation Barrel Roll, realising that if this trail stays open, South Vietnam would lose. Before I continue, you see throughout this entire war, anything can make the South crumble. It's not because the people of the South wanted to be communist. A lot of them in the South wanted to be capitalists after seeing what communism had done to China. But because there was constant infighting between factions, and because everyone was vying for power, so the person in charge couldn't focus on the war because he or she were constantly being undermined. It's like the leaders of the South didn't want to win this war, but just wanted power. Anyway, by the end of 1965, the US ground forces had increased to 200,000, but still with a plan of defending the South. This defensive position would soon change, however, as General William Westmoreland believed that the US had superior equipment, technology, and other historic generals. But what they didn't have was morale, the support of the Vietnamese people, and good tactics. The idea was that North Vietnam was only a couple years old, poorly equipped, and used guerrilla tactics in a modern world. So just charge them with tanks, and they'll crumble. But as you keep on watching, you realise that that's not the case. But as he always does, Johnson approved, and the war escalated. Also keeping the theme, South Vietnam got a new Prime Minister, this time Air Marshal Nguyen Ca Cao Ky. Come late 1965, the US, needing extra arms, called in its SEATA, or Southeast Asian Treaty Organization allies, along with South Korea. But France, Britain and Canada chose to stay out. Despite the choice to go on the offensive, the harsh conditions and lack of progress made it feel like they were still defending against an invisible foe in the South. But don't worry, good old LBJ assured everyone that everything was going to plan. Amidst the war, FLURO, or the United Front for the Liberation of Oppressed Races, rose up because the South were killing and harassing Buddhists and raiding sacred sites, and the North was a proclaimed atheist state. So they set out a lot of guidelines on how you're supposed to worship, where you can worship, which although have been relaxed in the Vietnam today. But because neither side looked like they were for religious freedoms, the only option was to make them stop. In December 1966, Ho Chi Minh said about or to the Americans, "If they want to make war for 20 years, then we shall make war for 20 years. If they want to make peace, we shall make peace, and invite them to tea afterwards." It had boiled down to a hard war of attrition, where the US had the technological advantage, but the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong had the knowledge of the land and the support of the people. Underground tunnel networks were built by the Viet Cong so they could secretly move around the countryside near Saigon, surprising Allied forces seemingly out of nowhere. Nguyen Van Thieu became the new Prime Minister of South Vietnam in 1967 and would remain until the end of South Vietnam's existence. 1968 marked the new year for the South Vietnamese. A holiday known as Tet was being celebrated. The North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong launched a massive assault in the south, known as the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive caught everyone by surprise. It saw 85,000 troops attack over 100 cities, including Saigon, even the US Embassy. Despite being caught off guard, the South Vietnamese and Allied counteroffensive was powerful and effective. The city of Hue, the former capital which lay right on the border, was fiercely fought over, but while the fighting was happening, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces brutally executed over 3,000 people, known as the Hue Massacre. After a month of fighting, the city was retaken, but it lay in ashes, and it was one of the most bloodiest battles of the war. Now, folks, we're out of time, so I'll see you in the next video, Vietnam War Part 2.